It's Wednesday, April 12th, 2023, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and with me are my colleagues, Kiely and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, a change in status for Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. The Biden administration announces plans that it has to create a new briefing space for internet influencers, and we're creeping ever closer to the start of the Fox Dominion defamation trial set for Monday. There's a lot more that hopefully we will talk about before our half hour is up today, but I want to talk about a week in Nashville. The Tennessee Three threatened with expulsion from the State House for their role in anti-gun protests, and no one was surprised when Jordan Jones was expelled Thursday afternoon, and later that night when Justin, let me get that name right. Justin, help me with the names because I'm suddenly not feeling confident in my own script. The Justins, right? Okay, they're both Justins. I'm having a moment today. We were actually just talking about how each of our brains are kind of clogged with allergies, so I'm going to go with that one on that. But when Justin Pearson was ousted later that evening, but sandwiched between them was Gloria Johnson. She retained her seat by one vote, and the narrative on what was a political story about gun control in the state of Tennessee following a mass shooting in a school, it changed in an instant. And we saw that reflected in the coverage in that moment as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking that, you're having these kinds of displays in the legislature over an issue that they should have been discussing. And I think what the three representatives were the point that they were trying to make was that, look, we're talking about other things here, transgender rights and all the others, when we just had a mass shooting at a school in this very town. And we need to have a discussion about what are we going to do to have some sort of control over what happens in these schools, the security issues involving kids. And they were a part of protests that were happening all over Nashville about this, and they brought it to the floor. And the legislature said that was out of decorum. There was so many other things that they could have done as legislators to sort of voice their displeasure. They went the nuclear option by expelling them. And what we've seen is that, one of the legislators who's representing Nashville, he's back. The other one is slated to be back today. Right.
So we do tape at 11 o'clock. By the time that this is on the air, it's 6:30 on KBIA, or you're seeing it later online. He may already have potentially been reinstated in his position as well.
Yeah, the striking thing about this is, if you remember, a couple of years ago, something very similar happened on the very same issue on the floor of the U.S. Congress. The U.S. House, there was a protest led by the now late John Lewis, who they staged a sit-in on the floor of the U.S. House to protest the failure to debate gun legislation. And similarly, the majority party was upset. There were people who said this was against House decorum, but you didn't see the national legislature expelling elected representatives. And I think that's the key thing here. Both of these legislators who were expelled had just been elected. And so you're really going against the will of the people in their district. And I think that's what made this such a big story. It's really a very anti-democratic move.
And part of the issue here, too, which is something else that came up. So you have the issue of gun rights involved here. But it also interjected race. It also interjected voting rights and representation, which is also an issue. So Tennessee and other states all over the country are dealing with all of these issues at the same time. And their actions sort of brought all of that together into one particular issue. Who's representing who, the fact that you have these supermajorities that can do these types of things instead of maybe dealing with real issues. And then you have the issue of you had the two African American legislators who were expelled, and the one white woman who was also engaged in this, who was not expelled by one vote.
And that becomes a symbolic thing. Like when you say it becomes about race, it becomes about voting rights. This was not about gun legislation anymore. This is a racial story at this point. It speaks to who we are as a nation. And I can't speak for others, but I'll say this as a voting citizen in the state of Missouri and other people I've talked to across the country. There becomes the very quick, this could happen here.
Yeah.
I'm using my right to vote, and it's one thing if I vote for someone who democratically loses, but if I vote for somebody who wins and they're then expelled for using their voice
and representing their constituency.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing here. What you're seeing is this is the inability to compromise. Right. Legislatures are made up of people who represent individual constituencies, some of which are very, very different. They are supposed to go in, meet each other, get to know each other, understand each other's districts and point of view. And there used to be, back in the old days, members would go visit each other's districts and learn a little bit about them and then craft compromise solutions. That is not happening anymore. And increasingly, you're seeing these punitive measures that really are anti-democratic. And the woman legislator who was part of the threesome that protested and did not get expelled, she herself said, when asked, why do you think you weren't expelled? She said, I think it's because of the color of my skin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, really what we're talking about here goes back almost to the founding of the Republic. And it's whose vote counts, And, we talked on this show for years about gerrymandering and what that brings about. The fact that you have super majorities in many of these state legislatures, and a lot of that is brought about by the redistricting that happens every time there's a census, and then you have a one party having control of the
politicians
legislatures.
pick the voters instead of the other way around.
Exactly, and that's pretty much where we are now. So they feel like there's no need to compromise when I control it all.
Exactly.
And if you don't go along with me, these are the types of things that happen.
But the backlash, I think, is going to be horrific. And there was a Republican state official from Tennessee who said this has really set us back in terms of advocating or trying to get young voters to join the Republican Party. And I think, based on the young people we deal with here, it really, the thing that I observe is it doesn't matter where they grew up. It doesn't matter what color their skin is. This generation is a generation of tolerance and acceptance. And I think this tactic could backfire in a really big way.
Okay. There's news to talk about this week in the case of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter under arrest for espionage in Russia. He's officially been charged by the Russian government, and here at home, the Biden administration has given him the designation of wrongly detained. Now, Kathy, we've known that he was wrongly detained for pretty much the last 2 weeks, but explain why having that designation is important and what types of things can happen now that he's been added to that list.
Well, this allows the State Department to really to turn this case over to a special unit that the federal government has within the State Department to deal with hostage cases. So, as we've said earlier, Evan Gershkovich is clearly a hostage. This allows the government to act as though he is, that there are extra resources that can be brought to bear. There are also extra levers of pressure that they're now able to bring against the Russian government. But I think, I think the key thing here is to keep the pressure on and to say Russia has turned into a pariah state. I mean, it's worse than the Soviet Union in many ways. And Putin's idea is that he's going to silence any criticism by jailing reporters. And I think the Wall Street Journal is doing a really great job. They've put a lot of Evan's work outside of the paywall.
I was going to say that was one thing I noticed yesterday, that a lot of his work is outside of the paywall. All of the reporting that they're doing about his situation and efforts to bring him home, also outside of the paywall. So not part of, their business strategy, that they're putting all of their efforts towards creating awareness and creating education about what's happening.
Yes, and you are seeing the other media support the Wall Street Journal, which is interesting because it's a Rupert Murdoch-owned organization.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk a little bit later in the show about the Wall Street Journal butting heads with some other organizations.
Yes, and so, but what is interesting is that everyone is supporting this. The New York Times ran a big editorial late last week. I saw a lot of people posting pictures on social media of the extra seat at their Seder table for Evan.
I thought that was a really, really nice touch as I started seeing that fill my Instagram feed last Wednesday night, especially after I had asked you and Keith about some of the things that regular people could do. And Wednesday evening, when I saw empty seats at Seder tables across the country in the United States, it was an incredibly poignant moment.
Yes, it really was. And so I think you do see a lot of regular people. I am reposting, I've just started this, I'm reposting a story a day by Evan Gershkovich, because I think this is something that regular people can do. The stories are outside the paywall at the Wall Street Journal, and it just proves to Vladimir Putin that if you try to silence reporters, it's going to backfire on you big time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but, and I hate to throw a but in here because I'm in full support of keeping up the pressure on Putin. But it has had a chilling effect. It has already made other media outlets, in particular, especially those on the continent, on the European continent, be very careful about how they're covering what's happening involving Russia and the Ukraine. And it's also had of course, it's always had a chilling effect, as long as Putin's been in power, a chilling effect within Russia. I mean, you don't hear very much right now about the dissident movement that's been there and is still there, but he has really clamped down, and what he's shown is that I'm not only going to clamp down on what happens inside my country, but I'm also going to clamp down on anyone who's in my country reporting on what it is I'm doing, and that has a chilling effect that just reaches a long way.
People have pulled, Western news organizations have pulled out reporters, and it's understandable why. I think this is why I hear what you're saying, and it's really hard, but I think it's easier to fight for freedom when you're in exile than when you're in prison. So this is why I think it's so important for us to support journalism in exile.
Oh, no, I'm absolutely in agreement with that. I think that we should continue to do that, and I think that the Biden administration now has some levers that it can pull. I would not be surprised if Rupert Murdoch himself or his organization isn't trying to pull some levers behind the scenes to make this happen. I mean, it's not very often that you have a reporter from a major publication, major news organization, who finds him or herself in this kind of predicament. They'll usually go after someone who's in a smaller fry, but he's really gone after. I mean, it's almost like he's trying to send a message not only to the United States but around globally.
Capitalists. Yeah, he went after somebody who worked for sort of the ultimate publication of capitalism.
Right.
So let's talk about that for a second. There is some news. Fox News has settled a defamation case. Now, it's not that one. The network is actually set to go to trial on Monday in a Delaware court to defend the defamation claims by Dominion Voting. This case is with a Venezuelan businessman. Now, what was alleged and what did Fox News cop to?
It was a similar situation. This was back when Lou Dobbs had his show on Fox, and they came and made a similar accusation. Same company, Dominion, that somehow this particular person, this Venezuelan, was the COO, I think they called him, of the operation for Dominion to do exactly what it was doing, and this person filed a lawsuit.
Exactly what it was not
doing. According to them, and so they settled that lawsuit, but here's the bigger lawsuit, and now Fox is getting ready to go to trial, and now they've upset the judge. Yeah. So the judge is upset. Let me give you the quote from the judge, and this all revolves around the fact that Fox had been claiming that Rupert Murdoch was an officer of Fox, the larger Fox, Fox Corporation, when he's also a officer of Fox News, which is the operation that Dominion is suing. And there's some differences there. So the judge is like, whoa, wait a minute. You've been claiming this, but he's also this. And so the judge said, my problem is that, and I got this from the Washington Post, who's quoting the judge, my problem is that it's been represented more than once to me that he's not an officer of Fox News. I need to feel comfortable that when you represent something to me, it's the truth. I'm not very happy right now. I don't know why this is such a difficult thing. That's what the lawsuit is about. I mean, I'm looking at this lawsuit and I'm like,
whose truth?
Yes. And I'm like, Rupert, dude, settle. This is not going to turn out well. I mean, it just doesn't look good for Fox right now.
That being the case, right? So we're sitting here, we're having this conversation, and it's, I don't know, 11:22 on Wednesday, April 12th. We're going to sit here again a week from now after the beginning phases of this trial next Monday. Do you think we're having a conversation next Monday where maybe somebody comes to their senses and settles?
I think the ball is in Dominion's court. And
what they're willing to accept in a settlement or not.
I think that, well, and are they willing to settle?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, should they be willing to settle? And remember, there's another lawsuit from another company, Smartmatic, that is asking for almost double what, or maybe not, another $1 billion on top of what Dominion is asking for.
So instead of $1.6 billion, it's going to be $2.6 million.
Exactly. And so if they settle
once
with
you're past $1 billion, what's another one here or there?
They've got to settle with both. So I think the reason you saw this settlement is with an individual. It's a lot easier to buy off an individual than two companies whose reputations you've smeared. So we'll see. It's a lot of money, even for Fox.
Yeah, I keep looking at this and I'm going like, man, how is this going to trial? But I'm with you. I think it's Dominion. I think they're the ones that are basically saying, look, there's more at stake here than just the money.
Like our democracy. While we're talking about, they're just themes here today. While we're talking about the justice system, Wall Street Journal also had a hand in this next topic, too. I want to talk about the investigation that came out last week from ProPublica. Earlier this year, 3 reporters there started looking into the travel of several members of this U.S. Supreme Court. They had no idea what they would find, if anything. They just started digging because that's what enterprise reporters do. But then they hit pay dirt. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, they found, had taken some flights aboard the private jet of billionaire Harlan Crow. And at first, they had been flights found between Connecticut and Washington, D.C., but then they found more. The reporters, Ernest, said that they told CNN that this literally snowballed on them, that they then find this like ultra luxury trip to the Pacific Islands. They keep finding more sources, more data, and it results in Thursday's story.
It results in a big story. And I mean, if you're Chief Justice John Roberts, you're probably going like, what else can I do here? It's like, the court is crumbling. I mean, the credibility of the court is probably the best way to put it. The credibility of the court is crumbling beneath my feet, and there's not much I can do. And Justice Thomas's explanation of what he was doing said, hey, I checked with my colleagues when I first got here, and they said this was okay. Really? That's all you got?
Somebody said it was all right.
Somebody said it was all right, so I did it. I mean, on top of the fact that, we have, I don't know how much evidence about, what's going on with Jenny, his wife, and her connections to big mega donors and others in the Republican Party and in the conservative right wing, and these are cases that Justice Thomas has not recused himself from. So I mean, it just further creates a credibility problem for the Supreme Court that just can't be ignored. So at some point, I think I was reading today where Charles Schumer is going to have the Senate Judiciary Committee take a look at this. I mean,
which kind of makes sense.
Well, there is no real code of ethics for the Supreme Court justices. There is for every other judge in the federal system, but not for the Supreme Court. And I think what will happen is, if the court doesn't impose one on itself, Congress will do it for them.
But there is a law that mandates that the justices declare when they take these kinds of gifts, and Thomas didn't do that. So I mean, there's something that, I mean, I don't know if this triggers the law, but I think this is where Schumer's going to say, hey, we need to take a look at this.
Even if there isn't a specific code of ethics expected of a Supreme Court justice, as there would be lower level federal justices, I think about our standard as journalists. You don't accept a gift that has more value than a T-shirt. If somebody's sending me in a private jet to a Pacific island on a ultra luxury vacation, I'm thinking twice before I accept that, if I'm in that kind of a role, and who I need to report it to. Right. One of the things I said the Wall Street Journal was going to factor into this story again as well. There's an editorial that was in the Journal that was coming down pretty hard on the way this ProPublica piece was written, claiming hyperbolic and biased language in some of the ways that they described the extravagance of these trips. What are your thoughts on that one?
I think it was written just the way any investigative piece would be written, and I think there was nothing unusual about it. One of the things that struck me about the piece, first of all, how incredibly assiduously it was reported. I mean, they really got all kinds of sources. But the other thing is, if you read it as a reporter, you know that more than one person dropped the dime on the justice. So it's not just digging, but they had some good inside sources. And that tells me, when you see that there are people who were maybe working for this billionaire or involved in being aides or servants, who saw what you just alluded to, the ethical problem here, and thought somebody needs to know about this. And that happens when you're a reporter. People who are bothered by what they're seeing will come forward if they know a reporter's working on the story. And that clearly happened here.
And if you're talking about doing a story on a Supreme Court justice, you're going to vet that with a team of lawyers. So I almost 100%. Bet that ProPublica probably hired an entire firm to go through that thing before they decided to put it up online. But the one thing I will say about this reporting is that it demonstrates the power of good investigative reporting and the fact that we don't have enough of that going on. Can you imagine how much, how many instances like this go unreported because we don't have that kind of investigative strength within the media?
And the best line in the piece that's on our links blog, where the reporters were talking to CNN's Oliver Darcy about how they went about this, was, if there's a if there's not a politician, but if there's a big money donor out there who is wanting to go ahead and support good journalism, there are plenty of good investigative nonprofit journalism organizations out there. They'd love to have a conversation. Right. Last week, right at about the time we were recording our show and talking about Twitter removing the blue check mark from the New York Times' account, it slapped labels on NPR's Twitter account, citing it as state-affiliated, the same label that is given to China Daily and Russia Today, the government-owned channels with heavy influence on the editorial product. That label has been toned down some and now reads government-funded media, just as it does on the BBC's website. Now, earlier this morning, NPR has come back and said that it is going to basically leave its Twitter account dormant. It is going to stop feeding on any of its on the main Twitter account or any of its NPR associated vertical Twitter accounts. It's going to stop using them because of the inaccuracy and the unfairness of that label.
Yeah, I mean, these are not government-owned entities. Nope. They do receive some public funding from various sources. And I will say there are times when Congress tries to interfere, and they usually get a strong pushback because we have an open system in which we're able to do that. But there is no such thing. First of all, NPR and the public PBS broadcasting gets only a small portion of its funding from U.S. government sources, from a subsidy, taxpayer-based subsidy.
And PBS far more than NPR.
Yes, and as people who listen to KBIA will know, because we just finished a funding drive, it is mostly donations from you, the listeners, who are funding this operation. And that money goes also to the national NPR. It is a fundraising not just for KBIA, but so that KBIA can pay NPR for the programming. So that is a libel, really, and to suggest that even worse libel is to suggest, which is what this is doing, that there are people in the government who are going in there every day and telling these broadcasters what they can and can't do. We can tell you right now that's not happening.
Right. And again, this is all brought about by Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter.
Yes, it is.
And
ruining a brand. It's a case study.
Yeah, I know. I mean, he basically is going after those who he considered to be enemies, and NPR fell on that list somehow, some way, and there was no need for this. Twitter already had a way to deal with this, and a way to and it was working. It was working for NPR. It was working for the BBC. And then he comes in and he says, "Nope, we want to go this route." And then he dials it back, but he doesn't dial it all the way back. And now here we are, with NPR saying,
"Can we
we're out."
exchange Elon for Ethan? Because I think Elon might be much happier with Putin. They seem to.
Evan,
yeah, sorry. Yeah.
We're all mixed up with names today. I will say I had a conversation with some of our colleagues in management at KBIA, and KBIA as a member station is not carrying this label. It's not been labeled as such by Twitter, and is continuing to use Twitter in the short term, at least, until anything there changes. We still have a following there, and we understand that some of our local audiences here in mid-Missouri are reliant on those KBIA Twitter feeds, including ours here on Views of the News. So we'll share some of those addresses with you in just a minute. But speaking of Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and the internet in general, influencers have found a new outlet for fresh content. The Biden administration announced Monday that it's creating a second separate press briefing room to accommodate influencers as it better tries to connect with young voters. And I guess I'm going to say this in the form of a question, the way that young people might. What could possibly go wrong? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I understand why they're doing it.
Yeah.
The question becomes, does it look like you're just pandering to reach a certain audience, or are you going to actually provide some news and information that is vital to them and can help them to better engage with the administration?
At the same time that the administration has now banned TikTok because of commercial and political reasons, banned TikTok from federally owned devices, and is actively pushing the consideration of legislation to ban it further.
Well, irony alert.
Right, exactly. It drips with irony. Well, that music means we're out of time before we could even finish talking about everything we wanted to today. Thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about the topics we talked about on our links blog at kbia.org. You can download this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Find us on Facebook, or that Twitter handle is @Views on KBIA. You can watch and listen again, leave comments, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, to Kia Thomas for handling the audio, Tim Pilcher for composing our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.